Okay, how's everybody doing today? I think we're a couple minutes late, so I'm going to just jump right in. I appreciate you coming to our session today. I'm going to try to keep it to 45 minutes, but I do have 10 or 12 slides to go through, so I'm going to talk pretty fast. So I apologize. I'll try to make myself slow down a little bit. Looking forward to questions at the end. If you have any questions, please send them as you go along, and we will answer them at the end of the session. So today we're going to talk about organizational readiness and the different delivery models for RPA, right? I tried to make, as all of my webinars, I tried to make it very tactical, very practical. I'm not going to do elaborate models and drawings and designs. I'm just going to try to keep this to the level of, hey, this is what we've seen with working with other people. Here's some practical things to know. So if you want to get into more detailed modeling, we can certainly have that discussion at a later date. But for today's session, I'm going to try to keep this at a very pragmatic level. All right, so I'm Tommy Simon. I'm president of our RPA business here at Team International. And very excited about RPA, big champion. I believe it can make significant difference in organizations. And I enjoy my job of helping companies who want to realize that value, helping them implement and set up operations that allow them or enable them to take advantage of RPA. So let's talk first about the delivery components. When you're talking about setting up, different bots, there's a few areas. Oh, I apologize, I hit the wrong button. Let me just come down here. There we go. So when we're talking about setting up different delivery components within RPA and you're trying to set up an organization, you need to look at 6 different things. I will tell you, I did not create this slide. I stole this. I don't even know where I came across this slide, but I think it does a great job of kind of summarizing the things that you need to consider when you're implementing an RPA practice. Certainly, you need to understand what your strategy is going to be, right? Is this divisional? Is it top down? Is it bottom up? I think we've talked about some of those in previous sessions this month. But you want to make sure that you have a clear charter, a clear roadmap. You understand what are the automations you want to go after. You also want to understand your approach for it. Do you want to do top-down CoE or do you want to do citizen developer, right? So you have to consider all of those factors within creating a strategy. That comes first. Okay, and then you need a technology strategy to support that, right? Which is, what tools you're going to do. Of course, you could, AI is a big component of RPA now, intelligent automation, so is OCR. But you also need to think things like, do you want to go with one of the leading tool vendors? Say Blue Prism, UiPath, Automation Anywhere, probably the 3 biggest. Microsoft's getting into it. They're going to be a huge player for sure as they integrate into Teams and Power Apps. So what is your technology strategy? Are you going to have one tool? Are you going to have multiple tools? Are you going to have enterprise level automations with maybe say a Blue Prism? Or are you going to have citizen developers with UiPath, or maybe you want to have even how you're going to leverage Microsoft in at the masses, and how that's going to how are you going to integrate all of those different tools into the overall strategy. So then you need governance, right? So you need to manage this, as we talked about. How are you going to integrate the tools in? How are you going to integrate the processes? What are the standards for development? What are the standards for QA? How are you going to support? What's your DevOps practices? So there's a whole host of governance ideas or governance topics that you need to cover, right? And then, of course, part of governance is also defining what the roles and responsibilities, and we'll talk about that in a second. People enablement is often overlooked. And I think it's the most important thing. There's certainly change management that needs to go on. People are certainly weary when they hear that RPA is coming in. They think that maybe they're going to get their, be replaced. I will tell you that far more often, what happens is those people are freed up from mundane, boring tasks, and then they become happier employees, and they're able to do more higher value things, and maybe even go in and take jobs or new positions within the company because of that, and therefore, from a company standpoint, the cost avoidance basically comes in not from laying somebody off, but from not having to hire somebody new, and that's where a lot of the cost savings comes from. So you need to address that entire component of change management around people, but then also what are the new skill sets that you're going to need, basically, what are the new management structures and processes? What's the new work you may actually do an a reorg as you automate things, so that people can realign to their new duties, and maybe you may have new management teams, new structures that need to be considered as well too. All right, and then you need to understand the operating model, right? So, okay, RPA is great, and you've got all this process improvements, and you've done all of these automations, but now you've got to start thinking about how do you support those in the long haul when changes happen, as they always do. How are you going to support those? How are you going to, when there's conflicts between processes, how are you going to mitigate those issues? So the operating model is extremely important. And then the last one is course development and support, which, is, and frankly, in my experience, is the easiest of the six here to manage. So what are some of the key success factors that you want, right? And so organizational commitment level, these are factors that you need to consider when you're thinking about what model to select, right? So there'll be multiple models. You can do internal, you can do external, and so you need to look at some factors that need to be evaluated to determine which model you should select. The first one would be organizational commitment level. So let me give you an example. If the organization is extremely committed and has decided this is a strategic initiative that's going to happen, and they've set goals for each department, each division, each company within their within the roll-up, then building an internal team makes a lot of sense, because the organization is going to be it's going to be a long-term initiative. The company's already expressed that commitment. If, on the other hand, the organization is kind of trying it, right? We're not sure about it. We've heard that we need to do it, but we're not exactly sure how to get started. Well, that's not an entire commitment level, right? And so you may not want to go build a big team of internal developers or internal analysts out if the organization hasn't completely committed to it yet. So that's certainly one of the things. Culture is another big thing. So preference and attitude. Some people, like outsourcing and are used to it, and it's part of the culture. Some people, detest outsourcing and hate it, and so you need to kind of consider that when you're looking at what the deliverable model is. What are the preferences of the organization? Also, risk aversion versus funding. So if you want to reduce risk, you're going to use an outside source. You want to increase risk, and the reason I say that is because if you're going to go build a big team, there's a risk and financial risk that's involved with that. You can always bring in a vendor, but you have the option to stop working with that vendor and not have a lot of financial commitment. So that's certainly, risk aversion is certainly part of it. And you look at risk aversion as what's the level of funding that the organization wants to do. So if the organization has said, hey, I want $5 million, and I've put it out there, and we're going to start a program, we're committed to this, well, great. Then an internal model makes a lot of sense. If it's hey, we're going to fund these investments as they come in, then it's hard to build a team around that, and therefore you want to look at maybe use an outside delivery model. So organizational culture is certainly part of it. Organizational program maturity. How fast and how well organized is your company at building programs out quickly, right? Starting from scratch and building out a program quickly. If they've done it multiple times, then great. An internal delivery model makes a lot of sense. If, on the other hand, that's not something they're used to or haven't had a lot of success in the past, then maybe you want to get started with an outside vendor model before you look at the internal model. And one thing that's overlooked a lot is the stakeholder personality. you know, when I know you've never done that, but I've worked with a lot of stakeholders who had some big egos, and a lot of what their preferences and their attitudes really depict, you know, what, you know, how you need to build a model to support that specific stakeholder. For example, if it's somebody who's always, hey, I got to get done now, yeah, that's not going to be conducive with trying to build out an internal model, right? You're going to need to be able to scale and scale quickly. If it's got somebody who's more methodical, more planned out, wants to know, have the plan very detailed before they get started. Well, that may lend you the time and the process for doing internal versus external. All right, and then a couple of the other things to consider is naturally you want to look at your business driver. If time to value is an issue, as an example, then you want to probably bring in some outside because it's going to be quicker to get ramped up on it from the outside. If, on the other hand, you want to look at ROI and cost savings over 4 or 5 years, then looking at building an internal team makes a lot more sense. All right, and then ability to scale is an important one too, as I mentioned with the stakeholders, versus the aggressiveness of the goals. If you have a 20 million, you want to cut 20 million in expenses over the next 3 years, that's going to take you quite a bit of scale to get to that point, and trying to do that completely internal may be very difficult. Versus if you're keeping it to a division level and you've got goals of getting to 2 to 3 million in savings, then building an internal team can certainly support that kind of scalability. All right, and then the presence of SMEs and citizen developers is very important as well too. Really, whether you do internal or external, you're going to have to figure out where your SMEs and citizen developers come from. The biggest part of RPA and the failure of many organizations is the ability to have a consistent pipeline of good processes to do with RPA. So how do you combat that? How do you make sure that there's a funnel across the organization to make sure you keep your teams busy? That funnel is a very important part, because if it's up and down, having an internal team doesn't make sense, or at least 100% internal team doesn't make sense. If it's more consistent and planned out, and you've got enough in your funnel that you can predict out what you're going to do the next year or two, then certainly having internal resources make a lot more sense. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, and let's talk a little bit about the roles within that you need to consider when you're building out a program, an RPA program. So certainly you're going to need somebody to lead the CoE. You're going to need some project managers. You're going to need subject matter experts and champions. They're probably the most important of the whole group. You're going to need business analysts, or you're going to need to do some business analysis. So you need to kind of figure who's going to do that at a departmental level. Then solution architects are, to look at and be able to take those requirements and come up with the right solution, particularly when you're talking about intelligent automation and you're looking at AI, you're looking, imaging and the different components that you can bring into RPA, business rules engines, etc. Well, typically you have a solution architect that kind of puts that solution together, and they work with the infrastructure architect. And I put the infrastructure architect not because they're a core member of necessarily the RPA team, but when you get started, you're going to have to make a lot of infrastructure decisions, and that needs to be reviewed over time. So you're going to need someone who's working with the solution architects to make sure that infrastructure costs are not getting out of control, and that security and risk are addressed. And of course, you're going to need developers, QA, and the last thing you're going to need is support. So, some of the questions you got to decide when coming up with models is which roles will be provided in the business line versus the CoE, which roles are you going to do internally versus externally, how many of each role do you need, how are you going to structure those, are they going to be by departments or business lines, are they going to be by functions? So these are all things that you need to consider when you're thinking about your delivery model. All right. And then real quick I wanted to just talk about the RPA process. For most organizations, it's someone like this. It can change, but it is a pretty standard process. You identify the candidates to automate, you qualify it in somewhat manner, right? You select some bots to get started with that have high ROI, high visibility. You prepare a feasibility study to make sure you're going to get the return, so a detailed qualification, if you will. And then you create a project plan to get them going. You develop them, you test them, you do UAT, and then at the end you move them into production. So these are the steps of the process that are done by the roles, right? And then all of these steps have to be addressed in your delivery model. So I think that's all the kind of the background information on the different delivery models. Let's just jump right into what those models are. So there's a couple of internal approaches. First internal approach is the CoE driven, right? So CoE builds and works with departments to deliver the services, right? So they're intricately involved. And so in this model, it has some great benefits. When everything runs through CoE, everything's coordinated and prioritized, right? So it's a little more consistent and a little more flow. Expertise rides in the group, therefore it's not spread out throughout the organization. It's in one core group, so there's a lot of knowledge share, and there's a lot of positive impacts from that. And then, you know, typically because that core group's there, you can tackle more complex challenges, and you have access to the whole suite of tools within the organization to accomplish the need. So it may be a BPM tool, it may be an analytics tool, it could be AI, different forms of AI, it could be imaging and OCR. So, you know, having a CoE-driven tool, all of those things are going to be known by that CoE, and so when they do solution delivery, they can more aptly decide what the best approach is. And then from a reporting standpoint, you know, you probably typically have a dashboard or reporting structure in a CoE that actually shows how many processes and how many transactions, and actually can show you what the ROI, ongoing ROI is for the program. Some of the negatives, however, is, you know, if you're doing it through CoE, you're never going to get to everybody. I've never seen it happen. So it's just hard to do. You know, you also find typically that the champions are in the CoE, but you don't have any real business unit champions, or very few. And that in the long run is going to make it hard to keep the pipeline full. And then, you know, you always run across, you know, that business line, VP or executive, much as my people would say, probably I am, right? I get impatient, I want things now, right? And so you're always going to run into those departments, those business level executives that want it now. So how do you handle that? You know, how do you, when you're trying to have a consistent CoE with prioritization and somebody wants something now, you know, typically they're cowboys and will go out and just pay for it themselves, which defeats the purpose of a CoE driven center. And then of course, and to that point, is if everything's CoE, it's kind of like the evil empire, if you will, telling us that what we're going to automate and decide. So it can be, you can get a lot of organizational resistance because they feel like they're being, this initiative is being pushed on them. So, and that can cause a lot of conflict over the time. All right, so the second approach is more business driven, right? And I would say right now, this is probably the leading, you know, big enterprise accounts, you know, your Newell Rubbermaid, your Carlisle groups, they're all doing kind of more of a CoE driven approach. Now, but the vast majority of clients, I would say probably 75 to 80% of them are probably more business driven. It's being driven by some business unit or function. And so, and the larger the organization, probably the more the CoE driven. The smaller, the mid-sized companies, definitely more business driven. So the benefits of business driven is you get more champions, the business is, you know, heavily involved. So you're going to, you know, automation is going to be spread across all the different departments. So you're actually going to get a higher return because you're going to probably do more automations. And RPA, like a lot of things, is the more you do, the less the cost per transaction becomes, or the less the cost per bot becomes. And so the more you can do, the higher ROI you're going to get in the company. You can also get things done faster, so your time to value is going to be much faster. But there are some negatives. So the negative is, you're going to have, it's not going to be structured. It's hard for the COE to manage standards. You're going to sometimes wind up with different tools. You're going to have different people with different various knowledges. They're going to develop in different ways. They're going to go out and hire some contractor to do something, and now that contractor has developed and done a naming convention that's completely different from the rest of the organization. So costs can increase just because of the support issues that come up. That's one of the biggest issues. No clear standards and consistency can cause long-term implications from integration standpoint and support standpoint. So while it's a little bit of the wild, wild west, and that's a great thing, you're going to get a lot of business value from it. You have to deal with that wild, wild west. You have to deal with the chaos that's going to come from multiple people doing it multiple ways. All right, and then there's a hybrid approach, which is a little bit of both. And this probably, for me, has been the one that I've seen work most successfully. So you have a CoE Driven approach, maybe on the top, 3 to 5 processes per department, maybe 20 to 25. And a lot of times they won't use RPA, they'll use RPA in combination with BPM tools. So a K2 or Nintex or Pega or something. IBM has a couple of tools that are pretty good. So they'll use BPM and RPA together to look and tackle the biggest processes so that the organization can look and make sure that certain standards are being followed on those key processes. But at the same time, the business gets to, they're given some tools and some standards and say, okay, y'all can go do all these other processes on your own. And so there's some pros to that. Certainly the business gets more involved, and that, I think you have less organizational resistance. I think you see the business work closer with the COE when that happens, and therefore you have more consistency on standards across the organization. You will have inconsistencies, though, department by department, not a little bit in the standards, but also in just how they adopt. So you may not get the complete value throughout the organization, just because different departments will embrace it at different levels, right? I see I put the business may feel empowered to do its own thing in the wrong place, which what I meant by that is the problem is when you give the business power and they feel empowered, they start doing a lot of stuff, right? They start trying to say, well, if I can do it for this, I can do it for this, this, and this too. And in some cases, they start using, they start trying to automate some things that maybe shouldn't, or they maybe start using additional tools that maybe not into the architecture. So you just gotta, you want to empower the business, but you also want to hopefully hold them to some constraints in what they can do so that it doesn't cause problems throughout the organizations later as you try to support. All right, let's move on to the external approaches. So with external approaches, there's really 3 types. There's project-based initiatives. So, okay, a department you can do SOW based. We have these 10 processes we want to do. Let's set up a project plan for it, get a cost for it, and then we can manage our risk through a fixed price SOW. And there's some great things about that. So, you're going to get the experience of the vendor who's had experience probably in your industry and across industries. You're also going to be able to control the cost to some degree. And the ROI will be done at a process by process standpoint. If there's not a high ROI, you're probably not going to do that through an SOW. So the ROI can be very positive. Some of the negatives, though, are it's hard to scale at mass doing SOW work, right? You may have different vendors doing different work across departments, and they may have different standards and naming conventions, etc., which, unless you have a very strong operational DevOps group that demands certain standards and certain naming conventions, that can, control the vendor and make sure the vendor's doing it in a certain way, you will probably have issues down the road. So I would say if you're going to use this approach, make sure you have a very strong DevOps group with standards that they require for production, and certainly having certain development and naming right standards. One of the other negatives around here, it's kind of hard to measure return across the company at a high level when you have multiple vendors and multiple departments doing different things, right? So having a combined dashboard to track and report on the returns produced by RPA it gets harder and harder. So the next approach, hopefully I'm not talking too fast, guys. The next approach is team augmentation and the factory approach, right? So integrated internal vendor teams develop the automation, right? So it's typical staff aug. Typically can be done in the US, it could be done offshore, but it's a factory approach. You basically tend to work with a vendor who augments your team and does either development or works for a development team in a combined manner to do the development and testing and get it ready for production. So it's a very good approach for companies who are mature in RPA and who want to scale at mass. This is probably the best way to scale at mass. And so for those organizations that are more mature and have done it before and kind of developed their policies and their procedures, their standards, bringing in a team to augment and give them scale is a very good approach. It can be more expensive from some of the negatives, or it could be more expensive. It can also, if your expertise comes from the vendor, then sometimes it's hard to develop that expertise throughout the organization and get your SMEs and champions built. I will say the ones that I've seen most successful in this approach do a really good job of having SMEs that are identifying processes to be done, and then they work with the vendor to do the PDD, or the process design doc. And that can be leveraging an onshore or offshore BA. And then once that PDD is done, then the development team builds and tests it, and then sends it back to the company to do UAT testing and any final testing, and then works with the DevOps group to move it into production. So kind of that factory approach for software development works for RPA as well too. All right, and then the last one is, and this isn't, I'm going to spend a couple slides on this because not a lot of people know about this. Robots as a Service is aimed to simplify the RPA journey for our clients. And so I actually took that off another PowerPoint. I apologize, it sounds a little bit like sales. But basically what happens in a robot as a service is the vendor does all of the work with the SMEs of the client to do all the design documents. From the design document, they will then do all development, they'll execute the QA plan, and get it ready, and then test again with the client in UAT, and then they will help move it into production. So not a lot of difference from the team augmentation approach, with one exception. The client tends to not pay anything up front. So the development cost is delayed, if you will, until it's moved in production. And then when it's moved in production, the vendor typically charges a monthly fee to support, host, and make sure that the bot continues to do what it's supposed to do. So it's a software as a service model in a sense. You get a service that you pay for. Now, in some circumstances, they got to go develop the bot for you if they don't have it in their catalog. In the other instances, they may already have a catalog. For example, we have an AP. I think we did a demo on our AP module called FinBot. And so in that circumstance, the vendor can have the bot already built. And so when you order it, they just basically set it up, configure it for you very quickly, and then they start charging a monthly fee. So it's a typical software as a service model where the bots are hosted, managed, and developed by the vendor, And so, and again, the good thing about, there's some good things and there's some bad things about this. The good things is it's lower risk, right? For the client who, doesn't want to go build a team to try and bots out, it's a good, effective way for them to lower their risk. But there's also, and because that the costs are not, because the costs are not incurred until the bots are in production, then the ROI is much, much higher, right? So if ROI is based on NPV value. So if I pay investment now, right, and I get recovered over time, that's great. But if I can get that investment over time without having to put anything up front, then my ROI is going to be much higher. And then the other thing that people don't think about is being able to do this is if you're not putting investment out up front until you start realizing the value, then that means you can do more bots at one time. Instead of doing 5 or 10 at a time, you can do 50 at a time because you don't have the upfront investment, and the money that you start saving will pay for the bots, will more than pay for the bots. So it becomes a net positive cash flow, which allows companies to scale much, much, much quicker. And again, companies with catalogs who can come in and implement, say, 40 or 50 at a time that they've already built, your time to value increases as well too, along with the ROI. So you'll be able to experience the value very quickly, and you'll be able to do more with less, if you will, with less financial investment. All right, and then the last one is negatives. Can be more expensive over time, certainly. So your NPV, if you look at it over 4 or 5 years, it's probably a little bit higher if you build them than yourselves versus if you're doing a robot as a service model. But when you consider the risk into that you had to take, it can be, it's, even though the MVP may be a little bit less, when you look at a risk score in there, it actually, I would say, most of the time tends to benefit the client. Vendor controls the environment, so you need to make sure your risk and security policies are in place and that those vendors adhere to those policies. If you're doing a robot as a service model and you want to do something custom, right, that's outside of what the vendor has in their catalog or in their bot catalog for you, then it can be a little bit more expensive to make those types of changes over time. And then the last thing, and this is from the business standpoint, not from the vendor standpoint, when you're doing bots as a service and you want to get value, you've got this great business case, this great ROI, but you're not having to put any money up. What will tend to happen is you can put things off. I can get to it next week. I'll do that next week. I'll do that next week. And instead of being able to realize value in 4 or 5 weeks, it may take you 15 weeks to get something implemented, or 20 weeks in some cases. So you lose a lot of the urgency from the business itself, and so that can directly impact the time to value for your automation. So I think that's it. I think I did that as a summary. So as a summary, let me just kind of summarize what I said, and then we'll get to questions. Each approach has pros and cons. Look, whether you do it internal and any of the methods internally, or externally and any of the methods externally, there's going to be some pros and cons, and you need to match those pros and cons up with your strategy and your organizational culture, right? So you need to understand, to do that, you need to understand what are the long-term and the short-term needs of the organization. You may want to move from one model to another model over time as the needs of the organization change, right? Understand the level of the organizational commitment. Again, without, there are certainly some of these models that we discussed that you do not want to implement if the organization is not completely behind it. Determine your risk and investment ratio, right? So the higher the risk, the more, you may want to set up an internal, have an operational expense, an internal operational expense versus, the investment. So if your company only has a limited amount of funds to invest on RPA, going out and setting up a big organization probably doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So you kind of just got to determine what that risk versus investment ratio is. You also got to look at how fast y'all want to scale, what your objectives are, what your goals are, so that you understand how fast you need to scale to be able to meet those things. And I'll say this about whether you're doing 1 or you're doing 100, you have to make sure the business is engaged and empowered to be able to be successful. If they're resistant, it's going to be much harder for you to get the results that you should have. No matter what model you pick up and do, you probably want to have some kind of method, whether that's an internal SWAT team or a couple of vendors they can call. But you want to make sure that the departments, if they want to move faster, if they've got good ROI, they've got reasons to move faster than the roadmap is going to get to them, then make sure that they have the ability to do that so that you don't lose them. And then, I think it's important to find creative partners that share risk and reward with you. There's different ways to build models out, and I think the more you have a partner that will share those risks with you, the more successful you will be. And I'll leave you with one other thing. It's happened several times before. If you pick a model that's a little bit more risk reward or shared risk with the vendor, particularly say it's the Raas model, make sure that you understand internally what your approval process is going to be. And really this goes for all models. Because RPA is new, there's a lot of people that have to get involved with approvals. It's IT, it's the DevOps group, the development group, the business group. And the one thing I've seen happen in a lot of these different models is people don't fully understand their approval process and what the new approval process is going to be for RPA. And therefore, there seems to it either stalls out or it significantly slows down the implementation of RPA because of having to uncover what that new approval process is going to be. It's something to start looking at day one as you start implementing this to prevent you from having issues down the road. So with that, I think that's my last slide for today. I think we have one more of these next week on how the industry catalogs can accelerate value. And so I hope you enjoyed today's session. And are there any questions?
Tom, I don't see the questions right now.
No questions? Does that mean I did a great job, or did I bore everybody and they're now asleep? I typically don't like to do such a text-based presentation, but I know illustrations and videos and stuff kind of break it up. But I wanted to give a very practical approach today to with some just basic pros and cons and basic concepts to consider. So hopefully it wasn't too plain, but if you, like I said before, if there's something that you would like to ask about in more detail or you want to get more elaborate, certainly reach out to me or Samir or Valentina, and we'll be glad to help. And so next week it'll be me and Valentina talking about catalogs. And with that, I'll end the session. Thank you.